With the internal of the building was just about complete. We were experimenting with lime washes, or colours and lime washes on the walls, when we realized that the dampness was coming back a little bit worse than we had anticipated, and managing it without a damp-proof course was not going to be possible. So the decision was taken to inject siloxane into the lower section of the walls to put a chemical damp-proof course in, which then left us with the residual salts in the plaster. So then it was decided to remove the plaster that was showing signs of damp and re-render.
When we realised that the damp issues were quite complex, we decided to seek the help of David Young, who's an acknowledged Australian expert in salt damp. David Young inspected the building and advised that salt tests be taken at a number of locations around the building at different heights. These tests showed that the walls were in fact saturated with salt and that large areas of plaster would have to be removed. We then, in consultation with David, marked out the line around all the rooms where the plaster would have to be taken off. And Andrew Steinkopf then proceeded to remove as much of the set and base coats as he could.
One of the challenges we have with looking after old walls is that they accumulate salt, and the older the walls, the more salt they're likely to accumulate. The common way this happens is due to rising damp, moisture rising in the porous masonry from the soils beneath, bringing salt from the soils up into the walls.
Nothing and off the scale.
In this particular case, there was so much salt in the wall that the plaster was breaking down. Analyses were taken to show the amount of salt, and the decision was made to take the plaster off the wall because the plaster was not very old and not very important.
When it was decided to remove the damp and salt-affected plaster, it was realized that the plaster was really very hard. It had been redone in probably the 40s or 50s with a very strong mix, and removing it with just traditional means, that is a hammer and a chisel or a small jackhammer, was doing too much damage to the stonework and brickwork behind. So it was decided, or what we experimented with, cutting the plaster into strips, that is using a diamond wheel on a grinder and cutting it through the plaster to the substrate about every 30 to 40 millimeters along the wall, and then chipping it off, which did very little damage to the masonry underneath.
Down here we have the poultice material, which is being used to draw the salt out of the wall. The poultice is made of a very highly absorbent material, and that's put on the wall wet. The water soaks into the wall, dissolves the salt that's in the wall, and then as the water dries, it dries back through this highly absorbent poultice. The water evaporates eventually from the surface, and the salt is left behind in the poultice material. When it's dry, the poultice is taken off the wall, and then a decision is made as to whether it needs to be further poulticed, another cycle of poulticing, or whether the wall has been sufficiently lowered in its salt content to enable the wall to be replastered with a traditional plaster finish and then painted.